Hi, and welcome to the unofficial start of Connect Safely Live. This is where we wait for the Facebook audience to join us, and I will tell by looking at a little icon in the left corner of my screen. So if you see me looking around, that's why. I'm Larry Magid. Michelle Borba is our host. Our guest, I should say. Maybe she could become the new host. What the heck? A co-host, anyway. And I'll introduce her in just a minute as soon as Facebook goes live. But good to see you guys. Carrie Gallagher is not with us today. She has a real job, a day job. And there's one of Michelle's many books. That entire bookshelf could be filled with her books. She's written even twice as many as I have, and I thought I've written too many. So still waiting for Facebook. And this portion, by the way, will be deleted. Hi, and welcome to Connect Safely Live. I'm your host, Larry Magid. And my guest today is Michelle Borba. I don't think I can even begin to recite her bio. Dr. Michelle Borba, by the way, and we'll get her to talk about what her doctorate's in, but she's written a number of books, many around the issue of bullying and empathy and parenting and child rearing and how to cope with teenagers and empower teenagers. And she looks familiar. She's been on the Today Show and many other television shows. She's quite a star. Michelle, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, you are so welcome. I am delighted to be here, Larry.
You know, I should ask, it's probably in your bio that I could read, but what is your doctorate in?
Educational counseling and psychology. I was a former teacher, and I'm a mom, but it was trying to figure out the psychology behind learning and kids getting along, and it was just fascinating, and it always has been.
Great. Well, my doctorate's in education as well, but I have the boring educational research track. So we always appreciated what you guys did. Well, you know, you've written a lot about empathy. In fact, you have a new book called About Unselfie, or The Unselfie, I should say. But I want to talk a little bit empathy, especially in light of what's going on. I mean, the elephant in every room. Actually, there's three elephants in the room right now. One elephant, of course, is COVID. That's been with us now for over 6 months. The other is the racial justice struggle that's really involving many people in our country. And of course, the other final one is we have an election coming. And I don't want to get into politics, but during this particular election period, there's a lot of enmities, there's a lot of anger, there's a lot of recrimination and accusations floating around from all sides. So all of that, it seems to me, ties into the subject that you're so knowledgeable about, empathy. So let's talk a little bit about that.
Oh, well, you're absolutely right. I think there's a perfect storm of why empathy is starting to nosedive down and why we better take it up a notch. First of all, empathy is something we're hardwired for, Larry. That's the most amazing part about science. And one of the reasons I wrote the book is if we're hardwired, the second thing that we were concerned about is it was nosediving. I mean, we were looking at prior to COVID, a very troubling trend that 72 different studies led by extraordinary researcher Sarah Conrath. Incoming college freshmen, they'd give them a little simple narcissism personality test for the last 30 years. And around the year 2000, they began to see empathy, feeling with another person starting to go down, or self-absorption starts to go up. So it's dipped 40% in 30 years. But the second thing that happened is now 7 months ago, we have COVID. And COVID does this absolute everything that makes empathy go up, go down. First of all, adults need to model it because that's the first and most powerful way to boost empathy is just seeing it, not a program. Second of all, stress actually can take it down. You dial your empathy down because you got to be in survival mode. If you don't have self-regulation strategies, it goes, well up until we have burnout. And then we have financial concerns. We have anxiety about our health and well-being. And we become more and more self-absorbed. So it's kind of like a push the pause button reset. If we want to be strong together, which is what CDC is telling us that's how we're going to get through this, then we better add empathy to the plate.
Now, you said something interesting. You said adults must model it. You're saying it's not adequate just to lecture your kids about how they should be more empathetic?
No, because the most interesting thing is don't tell your kid to do something, show him. I don't care if it's a skill or a habit or learning their manners. So I always tell parents, the best way to figure out if you really want to tune empathy up is ask yourself each night, if my child had only my behavior to watch, what would be taught today, which can be a scary scenario.
And just because you're on a business call or making business text doesn't matter. It is still, if you're doing it constantly in their presence, you're showing them, you're modeling for them.
Well, yeah, because we also know something really fascinating is that children who are more likely to be empathetic, and it isn't that we just want them to feel with somebody, but the goal is to help them get the trajectory so they do something about it. So it's called empathy in action. In
Hmm.
fact, I guess I should do a little footnote. There's 3 kinds of empathy because many parents go, oh my gosh, my kid doesn't have it because he watched Bambi and he's not a basket case. One kind is affect, and you can see that in a child or an adult because they do get a little teary-eyed, or they're reading a book, or they're watching a movie, or the kid was hurt at home and the kid just comes rushing in. Affective empathy is actually the easiest one, and even our little ones have it. You
Hmm.
can see them mirroring us, and I remember my 2-year-old jumping up on my lap and petting my face and putting a Band-Aid on my tear because he was so upset. But
Hmm.
that's one kind. The other kind that is critical for now, you mentioned racial injustice and what's going on, is the cognitive side. That's the perspective taking. It happens around 4 years of age, starts. Around 8, they start to get it, but we got to keep stretching it, where the child tries to figure out where the other person's coming from.
Hmm.
Oh my gosh, what a gold mine that is. So the final one is empathy in action. That's the piece where, so if you see it and you know it, what are you going to do about it? And that's the piece that we now know is actually tanking the quickest in Americans, despite phenomenal first responders we have and all the glorious things we're seeing about
Well,
stepping
it's
up to the
interesting
plate.
you should say that second one, because I've been thinking a lot about that. You know, my life's going pretty well. I mean, I
Yeah,
live 13 miles from the nearest California fire, but aside from air pollution, it hasn't affected me. I live in a county which has, at least over the last several months, had a high COVID rate, but probably because I'm being very, very careful, it hasn't personally affected me.
no.
I live in a country where there's massive unemployment and increasing poverty, but there, by the grace of God, fortunately, that hasn't affected me yet. I can't turn on the television or look at a newspaper without reading about what my neighbors, and I'm using the neighbors metaphorically, are going through. And and there are many people in my position, I suspect you are as well, who are doing okay, or doing pretty well, at least financially and at least health-wise. Yet, how do we process all of the news? If I were to truly process all of this news, kind of like the child who cries because they see a sparrow fall down, I'd be a basket case. I would be an
Yeah.
emotional wreck if I. But at the other hand, I don't want to, I'm not immune to it. I don't want to be cavalier about it either. Just because
Yeah.
I'm not in poverty doesn't mean my neighbors aren't in poverty.
Well, the key in that one is, first of all, it's striking the balance and realizing that we can be so overcome with all of this that we numb out. And that's called compassion fatigue. The
Hmm.
greatest piece on that one, going back to exactly what you said, was by Jonathan Haidt from NYU. He started to look at what helps make empathy go up and what diminishes it. And one of the things, bingo, you just said is all the bad, dismal news. If we keep looking at that bad, dismal news, after a while, our children develop what's called mean world syndrome. They start to see the world as a mean, horrible place. I mean, if you kept looking at, gee, just the George Floyd murder alone,
Yeah.
or you keep turning on a dial and all you're seeing is here's the steady death count today. If you keep watching those, it really does impact your empathy, and you start to go, what's the point? Your hope and optimism goes down, and there goes your mental health. And we're looking at, by the way, the CDC, who just issued last week a warning sign that was unprecedented, that our kids' suicidal rates were really going up in just this period. So don't go raising the white flag. The simple thing is, there's a solution to everything that you're talking about. The first thing is you start being selective on what you tell your kids about the news. If we turn off the TV and we start reading the newspaper, flat news is actually better for us as opposed to those vivid images. We can hear
Yeah.
Anderson Cooper say, watch out for the next few moments. We warn you that this is highly graphic and disturbing information. Turn it off, because that's going to impact you. I also love, and I do workshops with kids all over the country. I go to the back page of the newspaper, Larry, and I cut out stories about real children, fabulous kids. Then I blow them up, and they're called the good news reports. I mean, the best one that came out last week was on a 10-year-old and a 15-year-old in Philadelphia. 2 sisters that got so tired of the bad news. What they actually did was go down to their basement and start making a video on their just on their old phone. And every day they make a video of the good stuff that's happening in the neighborhood, send it to a few of their friends, and every one of their parents said, tell them to keep recording this stuff. Well, they went viral. So maybe one thing we need to do is every night ourselves as adults, our kids, is just tell them about the good stuff that's happening in the world.
And by the way, I rarely quote Joseph Stalin, but he did have a famous quote, which is the death of one person is a tragedy, the death of millions is a statistic. And it does kind of numb you after a while. And you need to kind of remember that behind every one of those numbers, I mean, we are approaching 200,000 Americans dead from COVID. And those are 200,000, at least 200,000 families, actually probably more, because some people have multiple families. I mean, to those families, it truly is a tragedy.
Well, there's another one that goes right down. You quote Stalin, I'm going to quote Mother Teresa. She
Good,
said,
that's an upgrade.
she said, if I keep looking at the masses, I will go numb. So what I do is I look for one. And that's actually what research says. If you really want to do the most fabulous thing in your home for your kids, is reach out to one person. How do you think the neighbor next door is doing? She's all by herself. How about we bake some cookies and drop them off at her driveway? If you start with just one, all of the research also says that you really do make a difference and you can activate a child's heart. It starts with empathy. In fact, you know, Larry, when I was researching on Selfie, I discovered that empathy is made up of 9 habits. Habit number 9 that we're aiming for is altruistic leadership, trying to get that kid to realize they can make a difference in the world. So I started interviewing just all the kids. The teacher said, go find out how that kid was raised. He's the most altruistic child you can imagine. And every kid I interviewed that was supposedly the altruistic, compassionate kid always said, oh yeah, it was how I was raised. Well, how you were raised? Well, my parents expected us to be kind. My parents always said, let's do something for somebody else. My parents always modeled being kind. And every child always said, it started with one. It was the moment that I gave the overcoat to the man and the look in his eyes was like, oh my gosh, I knew I could do something. It's back to Mother Teresa. She said, start with one. And that's a great tip to be able to do that in your own homes.
So I'm glad you raised that, because it is overwhelming. I mean, there's no way I can wake up tomorrow morning and solve racism, poverty, and make the world healthier, make the entire world healthier. But there's probably something I can do in my community, or something I can say to somebody, even online, maybe not maybe a kind word on Facebook or Twitter, maybe a small act of generosity in my neighborhood. Is that kind of where you're going with this?
Exactly. And the fascinating thing, Larry, is not only does that start the trajectory of empathy, because kindness boosts it and pushes it so the child begins to see himself and develop that thing called a caring mindset. Kids act how they see themselves to be. So we got to be careful on our praise. Let's start praising the kid for not just what you get, but what kind of thing did you do? Or did you notice that when you did that with grandma, you held the chair for her? Oh my gosh, what her face was so happy. There's so many things that science is now telling us that we can add to our plate that are so easy, that don't cost a tutor or a PhD, but if we do them, they raise mentally healthier kids, more resilient kids, because those are 2 factors that why we want empathetic children, but are also kids who are smart here and here.
Well, you just anticipated my next question, which is, in addition to altruism, what's in it for me? And I don't mean to say it crassly, but what's in it for my children? What's in it for you to be a kind, empathetic person? I mean, it obviously benefits the other guy, but what about you?
Let me count the ways. I was blown away with what the new science says that's certainly not in most of our parenting books. If you really want a happy kid, a mentally healthier child, you raise the kid who's kinder and more empathetic, because doing for others, giving, not getting, is highly peace. Mental health, but we also know employability. I mean, along the way, Harvard voted Harvard Business Review as empathy as the top employability factor a couple of years ago. I was working prior to COVID, obviously, in the Middle East. They did an economic focus group in terms of economic forum. Top employability factor, they said worldwide was there. So it's also the best antidote, I swear, for bullying and racism. In fact, I got into all of this, Larry, because I was working way back when to stop school shootings. And when I kept working on that and looking at the research, empathy was always the dormant piece at the moment. But if it's so dormant and that has such a trajectory, or it starts the bullying, and bullies very often have a low empathy piece, can we reactivate it? And
Yeah.
the answer was yes, you can, but it's not one simple little lecture. It's an ongoing piece that we've got to add to our parenting.
So that brought up my question is, if you have a child who bullies others, and I try to avoid the word bully because
Yeah,
no child is a bully. They may bully people, but they probably have many aspects to their personality. But if your child has been found to bully other people, what can you do to kind of instill empathy in your child and try to get that behavior to change?
I think the number one most important thing is admit it. Because very often we hear the call from the teacher, or we hear a call from a neighbor, and we don't buy into it because our children act differently with around us as opposed to another social situation. So that's number one. Number two, get a cadre. That means go talk to somebody who knows your kid in a different situation and find out what's going on. Number three is realize now you've got to do some really heavy duty reparenting. That's not going to be one lecture. It's going to be an overnight, a long process. First thing is spell out your expectations. We now know that children who are raised, even Olvea studies, when we look at children who are less likely to bully, they're raised in environments where the parent continually talks about kindness and compassion, and this is how we act. Your discipline is immediately, that was unkind. How would you feel if that happened to you? That feels plus needs question is critical. You keep talking about it so you get a trajectory. But we also know the fascinating thing, Larry, is almost every study said, give the kid real meaningful opportunities to see himself in a different light. When I look at a lot of children who had been bullied, and instead of suspending them, what they did is they put them in maybe a restorative justice situation, or they asked them to go and start helping a child who was 5 years of age every day prior to COVID, but you can still do it on Zoom. Mm-hmm. What they discovered is that the big thing that we do wrong is we assume the kid knew how to care. So what these brilliant teachers would do is every day pull the child who had been suspected of treating another child unkindly and start brainstorming, what's another thing you could do? Or how will you know when Noah, the 5-year-old, is looking upset? Or what are some things you could do to show you care? I remember talking to one boy who was 16, and the teacher demanded that every single day you're going to bond and connect with this 5-year-old. Around 21 days later, because it was daily interaction of teacher, what worked, what didn't work, they journaled it. What happened was you saw, because the kindergarten teacher took a photo of the kid, it was just absolutely mind-boggling. The 16-year-old, you saw him kind and caring. The most amazing thing was he went back to the teacher and said, I just didn't know that I could be that way. I didn't know that anybody would respond that way. But the best thing, Larry, was the 5-year-old Noah, who went up to the kindergarten teacher and said, I knew he could do it. Sometimes it takes a kid a long time. You should never give up on a kid, you know.
Wow.
5 years of age.
Wisdom of children. You said children are born empathetic. I mean, and children, by the way, are not born with racism. A toddler will not be a racist. They can be taught, but it doesn't come naturally.
Those are all learned behaviors.
Yeah. You know, I was thinking about, you mentioned watching television, and maybe I should stop watching TV myself, because two of the things that I've seen on television recently, one is bunch of people standing out in front of a Trump rally, and some will be interviewed and they'll talk in rational terms about why they're supporting the president, economic or whatever. And it's whether you agree or not, it's a civil answer. And others are just angry. They're just, you can see the anger, you can feel the anger. They're going on and on about the left-wing agitators and how our country's being, going through horrible things are happening. And then you turn on a protest rally, and the vast majority of people are peaceful and doing what they constitutionally are entitled to do. And then there's a handful of people who are angry, who are throwing rocks and screaming. And but unfortunately, the television tends to be dominated by the angry, vitriolic, sometimes violent or potentially violent individuals. How do we parse all this? How do we parse what's going on in our country, given the fact that I truly believe that most people, whether they have an R, a D, or an I in front of their name, are essentially decent, kind people. At least they were at one point in their life.
Yeah. I think the first thing we got to be very careful about right now is that, unfortunately, I've been in the news industry, as you have, for quite a while. And what's happened is over the last 10 years, oh my gosh, do we miss Huntley Brinkley? You don't, or Walter Cronkite.
Yeah,
You're
Walter.
not getting a real two-sided approach and hearing what's really going on. You're getting a more ratings-driven approach. If it looks like, wow, somebody's volatile, let's get in there and take it. So I think the first thing is we got to do a little more deeper thinking, and we got to really start asking our kids, how do you know? Where'd you get that fact? Because we're looking at a situation that I think is very scary, that even college professors prior to COVID were seeing our children, our college kids, that weren't getting into deeper thinking. They were going to surface. If they saw it, it had to be true. Same with us. We begin to believe it, oh my gosh, and instead of digging deeper and finding out or asking or interviewing others, we're not doing any of that, Larry, and I think we've got to.
Yeah.
Because it gives us a very stilted world. You know, the fascinating thing is I work all over the world, and the most really gets me upset is when I fly 50,000 miles across to the other side of the world, turn on TV, their views, they're more two-sided. Here's what's happening. I'm blown away with, I didn't know that about the US. I didn't know the water problem. I didn't know the other problem, because all we're hearing is the same thing over and over again. And that's disturbing.
Well, actually, for the past several months, I've been doing some part-time work for the BBC World News. And
Oh, I love
think
BBC.
and it's funny because when I was overseas one time, I can't remember, it was a hurricane or something was going on in the US. And I was changing the channel between BBC, Al Jazeera English, and CNN International. And CNN, you'd see, Anderson Cooper again, sort of blowing away, and the world was coming to an end. And then you'd watch the other news, and they talked about it being a problem. But if you were watching CNN at that moment, you would think that the entire East Coast was being blown off the face of the earth. And while there was tragedy, no doubt, when you're looking at it through that little tube, and unless the television reporters are trying to put it in perspective, it looks horrific. And the same, by the way, is true like bullying. When you look at bullying statistics, I'm constantly seeing epidemic of bullying, overwhelming number of bullying, 85% of people are being bullied. Yet the reality is that while it is a problem, and a problem that you have and I both have dedicated our careers to try to solve, most kids are actually pretty nice, and most kids are actually having a pretty good life. I mean, they're not suicidal, even though too many are. I mean, how do we put all of this in perspective?
Well, I think the first thing is we go into, remember the 3 kinds of empathy, A, B, and C. Affective behavior, that's doing it, and C is the cognitive. We got to get more into the cognitive right now because we're not. So your answer number 1, you've already given the solution. Flip the news channels. Don't just keep looking at one, look at the other. I am now purposely going to BBC. I am purposely going and listening to NPR. I'm purposely trying to listen and read different kinds of viewpoints and from flat books, because I got to dig deeper to find out, is my brain warped out here? Or is that the way that it is? Empathy is understanding at a deeper level, and we've got to do that. I just, by the way, did a Today Show segment on Monday. And the final question was, it was all on parents and teachers, and it was all about, what are we going to do because our kids are all Zooming? And the final question was, so what do we do? What's the single most important thing? I said, the single most important thing is become an ally with the teacher. And the question you're not asking the teacher nearly enough is, what can I do for you?
Yes.
Well, they went like, oh my gosh, I never thought of that. We're not, because we're thinking of ourselves. We got to reach out and start thinking of others. That's what empathy is. It's not soft and fluffy.
It's funny.
It's not. It's transformational, but it's trying to dig deeper, find out, and get the other point, and feel where the other person's coming from. Listening a little deeper. We're so quick to want to add our 2 cents. Listen a little longer to hear where the other person's coming from, and then ask the questions.
And that's a very important point, because I think we're all taught, that our status in life is partially based on how articulate we are, how clever we are, how we raise our hand with the right answer. And sometimes, even if you think you have the right answer, if you listen a little bit, you'll find out that there may be another answer that's worth pursuing, not to mention the respect you're giving to the person who's speaking.
Yeah. Well, remember, we got to keep doing this. Empathy is we, not me. So of those 9 habits, habit number 7 is collaboration. And we've become such a competitive society of pitting the kids. I interviewed kids and they all go, you're just pitting us against the other kid. We're all about a grade point as opposed to a human being. Maybe this is the time to reset our parenting, our society, and just help kids learn how to play shoots and ladders with one another and enjoy each other's company and hear where the other person's coming from.
I've heard this thing, in the workplace, working together is called collaboration. In school, it's called cheating.
Oh,
and there is no, there.
Up, up, up.
Yeah.
No, it's very sad.
So, you talked a little bit about, you kind of talked a little bit about this, but I want to kind of dive in deeper at how do we teach empathy and character development? What is a strategy that both educators and parents can use?
Strategy number one we've mentioned is we have to be convinced that empathy matters. It's all about the why. So I would strongly suggest maybe you get a little group together as parents, or maybe you start talking to the teacher, or you get a book like Unselfie or any other book on empathy, and you start reading it, because when you understand the strategy is critical, you'll be more committed to it. Number two is start with emotional literacy. It's the gateway to empathy. If we could do anything of the 9 habits, what we're realizing is that our children have been looking down, they've been looking at screens, and you can't feel with another person unless you can read that person's feelings. So just talk naturally with your feelings. How are you feeling today? Look at each other. Make one rule in your house, Larry. Always look at the color of the talker's eyes. Because our kids are looking down, look up. Why? Because it also makes you look more assertive, and you will. If you want to be an upstander, not a bystander, and you want to stand up for somebody, you better stand up strong. That's eye contact. We do a far better job of talking feelings with our daughters at age 2 than we do with our sons. So we know that from Yale. So talk feelings. Watch the movie Inside Out. Simply emotional literacy. You can prime your child. FaceTime with grandma, but listen to her voice. Watch her body posture, and you'll know when she's tired. That's the first. Number 2 is moral identity. That is, start making it matter in your house. Harvard did that incredible study where they interviewed thousands of middle school and high school kids of what matters most in your house. And what they discovered is 80% of the kids said it was the grade, or that my mom wants me to be happy. Only 20% of kids in the US, middle school and high school across demographics, said caring mattered. Now, the parents were in a state of, but it does. But the kids said, but you don't talk about it, Mom. So talk about it naturally. Make it be a moral identity. And third, I'd say, is that perspective taking piece. Let's get a little deeper in our thinking. When a child is so quick to say, here's how he thinks, how do you know? Let's look at literature. Let's read rich literary fiction. Let's step into the shoes of someone else. I say that, Larry, because one of the coolest studies on habit number 4 was when I was looking at proven evidence-based strategies to emphasize that empathy piece. What they actually discovered, Madison, Wisconsin, they put us into an MRIs, adults. They put the cones on our head. Empathy is right here. And when they read us passages like To Kill a Mockingbird or Grapes of Wrath or Beach Read, Danielle Steele or 50 Shades of Grey, they watched the part of our brain where empathy is. Literary fiction lit us up. Sorry, 50 Shades of Grey, we flatlined. So read literary fiction as a parent, but also be selective on what you read out loud to your kids. Larry, that's why Wonder is one of the top selling books for kids right now, because they're stepping into somebody's shoes. Harry Potter is rich with character and literary fiction. This is the time to be able to read those books and discuss them with your kids, and make sure you're giving kids books that have different diversity in them, gender, different kinds of understanding of incomes, because that's what we want our kids to do. Those are just the 3 habits, and they're critical.
You talk about emotional literacy. When Connect Safely, when we wrote the Parents and Educators Guide to Media Literacy and Fake News, we actually included a section in there working with the Yale Center for Emotional Literacy on emotional literacy, because we realized that emotional literacy ties into media literacy. How you perceive the information that's coming at you can help you process it and make you a more conscious consumer, because you're not allowing it to drag you. I mean, you'll have an emotional reaction, of course. I do every time I read a news story that affects me, but understanding that emotional action, letting me control the emotional reaction as opposed to the reaction controlling me.
And that would be called self-compassion, because before we can really start empathizing with others, habit number 5 is self-regulation. We got to figure out and identify our own stress signs. So if it's starting to go up, we can say to ourselves, why? And then what are we going to do to take it down? But you nailed it. You've got to be able to read your stress signs, because one of the things we're realizing is that empathy gap, where you see it and you understand it, but you're not doing something about it. It's very often because of the stress is going up. And maybe one of the other things that we all should, as parents, add to our plate is take the next couple of weeks and tune into our own signs. When do we know we're getting too stressed? It's going to be different for everybody in your family. But
Yes.
for some of us, it's like this. And some of us, we can feel that rush. So we can say to ourselves, next, level it. I'm like on a 10. I'm about ready to explode. Or I'm a 0. I'm a cloud drifting by. But you can also tell those strategies to your kids.
And what about stress within families? I mean, when you think about this, I've heard stories that there's more fighting going on in families, that abuse is unfortunately, domestic abuse is up. I understand why that would be the case, given what's going on right now, especially when gosh, in California, not only are we locked into our homes because of COVID, but I can't even, up until today, I couldn't even go for a walk in my neighborhood because of the air pollution. Talk about a stressor. Well,
we're on cabin fever.
Yeah.
So I think what we've got to do is back to what really matters. First of all, what really matters is, I think, one of the most powerful studies that goes right back to what you said. This was the APA, American Psychological Association, trying to figure out what's the key strategies we should be doing to be really good parents. And they analyzed 50,000 pieces of research, and they came up with 10 critical things that make good parents. Number 1 is we love our kids. That's like the no-brainer. Right. But number 2 has nothing to do with the kids. We manage our own stress. Because if we don't know how to manage our own stress, it spills over to our children. Our children need coping strategies, and so do we. So I guess a key question we should all be asking, what's the one thing we are modeling? Because this would boost empathy. It keeps the empathy up. What's the one thing we're modeling to our children, or we're teaching our children? So we all learn a coping strategy when our stress starts to build and we feel, okay, I'm on a 10. It could be deep breathing. It could be yoga. It could be, when we look at resilience theory, some people say it's faith or spirituality or prayer. Others say it's going and finding a book. Others, it's escaping to another room. It's listening to music. I don't care what it is, but everybody needs one thing. And they got to add that one thing that you repetitively do, because that's going to keep your empathy up, your mental health up, and it's also going to help us all be able to handle stress a lot better.
It's funny you say faith. I'm not a particularly religious person. I happen to have grown up in the Jewish tradition, and I'm thinking we're on the cusp of the high holidays, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Yes. And these are times within the Jewish tradition where you become very self-reflective. And Yom Kippur, you atone your sins, and Rosh Hashanah, which is essentially New Year's, you think back about the previous year, and up in the coming year, you think about your ancestors who have passed away. And I am curious, when I think about religion, both the role in religion as a positive force and the extent to which some of our religious doctrines teach us and emphasize, taking care of our fellow human beings, yet not everyone who practices the religion, so to speak.
It's the last book ever that I've written. Larry, I just turned it into the editor.
You and I are going to go on a 12-step program and not write any more books, right?
12-step. Yeah. I'm not announced. Yeah. But I had to write this last book, and it's called Thrivers, and it's out in March, but it answers that question. For 40 years, I've been trying to figure out, why do some people thrive? And the answer is the most amazing researcher. I went to University of California, Davis for a couple of years. Her name was Emmy Werner. She had the same question. And for 40 years, she's been tracking the same children. Now, what she discovered along the way, they were all growing up in the island of Kauai. I'll fast forward this because it's too fascinating, but some of them were homeless. Some of them were doing well. Some of them were abused. Some of them had schizophrenic parents. But a few years into it, she said, my gosh, a third of them are doing fine, despite enormous abuse. Why? Now, for 40 years, she keeps studying the same ones, and she finds out, when I wrote Thrivers, the 7 most critical things, one of them was faith. She said spirituality kept coming up over and over again because during the most horrific moments, they'd have this moment that they could pray or go back into, here's what I can do to help myself. Hobbies seem to be another one. She said, people who really are resilient are able to go to, is it knitting? Is it woodwork? Is it something? There's a piece that we can help our children. Do they have hobbies? Not ones that we want them to do, like you're going to do violin, but something legitimately that gives them passion. Third one is they have a sense of perspective taking, that when it's really, really bad, they're not the kid who's going to say, oh my gosh, the world is doomed. They put it into context.
Yeah.
We can do that right now with our own kids. I know it seems like doom and gloom, but let's look at the Spanish flu, or let's look at when there was smallpox. There was a horrible, horrible time, but look, people keep going and people keep going until finally they get a vaccine. That's what's going to happen.
Yeah.
If they put it into context, some
Well,
kids,
you know, and there are also things you can do. For example, we don't have a vaccine, but when I go for a walk, if the people around me are wearing masks, my stress level goes down. If they're not wearing masks and they get near me, my stress level goes up. That's not a very difficult thing. You can, if you don't have a mask, you can buy one for 50 cents. I mean, that's easy, right? And it actually has a huge impact on my emotional well-being if the people around me are wearing masks. Very easy.
Have you seen that ad on that Uber has? Is my
Yes.
favorite ad. Oh my gosh. And it's like, they've got 50,000 different people, each wearing a mask. But the key that we got to keep the kid is, here's Sally wearing a mask. She wears a mask. And it's like, if Sally wears a mask, she protects John. If John wears a mask, he protects Jenny. If Jenny wears a mask, she protects Robert. I'm going, that's exactly what it is. That's empathy. Each one is thinking of the other, not just themselves. And as a result, that's why we're strong together. And if we focus in on that, here's what you could do to help someone else. It actually, Emmy Warner, back to Emmy Warner and resilience, thinking of the other person, not yourself, actually helps your own mental health go up. So contributing to another, making cookies for the neighbor next door. There's some kids in Chicago. Oh my gosh, the teens. I said, how are you guys doing? And they said, we're really worried about some of our friends because they can't get to the school counselor. And we knew they were depressed before. So I said, what are you doing for them? Well, we decided that we're making quarantine gift bags. I said, what's that? We're just putting together these little bags, and then we make cookies, or we put in a handwritten note, or we put in candy. And then every day we drop them off at their driveway, a different kid. I said, how's it going? She says, well, it makes us feel so good, but we didn't know what it was doing for our friends. Each one of them is crying. They call back sobbing, going, I didn't know anybody was thinking of me. Thank you. And each kid who did the quarantine bag, now you got the entire community doing them. They said, it's making us feel so good.
Yeah.
So there you go. It's doing with the other.
It's so true that if you're making an effort, so, you know, if you're very passionate, for example, about who should be elected president, you can sit there and curse the television and talk about all the horrible things you don't like about the other candidate, or you can go to the website of the candidate you like and volunteer to make phone calls. Are you going to change the entire world and be a difference? I don't know, but you will you will be doing what you can.
You'll feel I think a lot better about yourself as opposed to just mumbling and swearing.
Exactly,
So
exactly.
Do something. It's activating it into a positive way. And it's not listening to somebody and then going, I'm going to do that. It's finding your thing, your little one thing.
Michelle, we could go on for hours, but we try to keep this to about 40 minutes. Let's end with your kind of top 3 or 4 tips that you would give to parents and educators, because that's our audience, about how they can instill empathy in their children and in their own lives.
Oh, I think number 1 is, please don't see it as something that's soft and fluffy. Understand that empathy is scientifically based now. We know our children arrive with this capacity to care, but unless we put it onto our parenting agenda, it's going to go into dormant mode. And I think that's the biggest problem. We're in sleep mode. Number 2 is just keep modeling it. We talked about that today, but if you really want your child to pick up any character trait, oh, please, please, whatever the character trait is, I hope it's empathy, but it could be responsibility, it could be respect, model it. Larry, the best book I ever read in my life was called The Altruistic Personality. I was actually on the killing fields in Cambodia in a crying jag going, how can people be so cruel? It was mind-boggling, and I'm not going to get into the cruelty, but it was so horrible. I walked outside just sobbing found this book called The Altruistic Personality by Samuel Alliner. And what he did was go and interview rescuers during World War II who rescued perfect strangers. He interviews them once again to find out how'd you get that way. And every one of them said, that's how my dad was. He modeled kindness. So that's how my mom was. She modeled kindness. Model it. And third is, here's the opportunity to bring reading to the plate. Keep reading to your child. Don't stop reading out loud or read together. How about just putting a sheet over the dining room table and make it into a reading fort? Every night, just bring a pillows and your dog and find a book and a flashlight. There's a memory that'll last forever. But as you're reading those glorious books, remember, Richard Davidson from University of Wisconsin would say you're actually activating empathy in your child's head. Find powerful books.
And if I can add one more thing,
Yes.
have dinner together as a family and just be
yes.
together. Even if you don't worry about what the conversation is, just have a conversation and try to put those phones aside, not in front of you during dinner. Well, Michelle Borba, author of Unselfie and also End Peer Cruelty, Build Empathy. You can find her at michelleborba.com. If you can't spell it, just Google it, because Google will find it for you. And you may, I love watching you on TV, and it's been such a thrill to interview you. And by the way, if you're watching this on Facebook, feel free to share it. We'd love to get this out to as many people as possible. So you can just go share your post and others get to watch it. Thank you so much, Michelle.
Oh, you're so welcome. Love talking to you, Larry.
My pleasure. Take care.
Thank you.